So with everyday peace indicators, we have conducted this research in localities in 11 countries, quite literally from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe and countries in between, including the United States, in a community in which there are tensions between the African American community and the police. And one of the really interesting things about this very comparative international research is to compare this to my own upbringing. I grew up in Northern Ireland in the midst of a small but very bitter civil war. And it's interesting to travel around to other conflict-affected societies, whether it's Lebanon or Bosnia or parts of the Philippines, and see that many of these issues are similar, and therefore many of the approaches that we need to deal with these issues are similar as well, or at least can learn from one another. So the amazing thing about asking people in conflict-affected societies, what does peace mean to you, is that the response is usually initially silence, followed by, oh, no one has ever asked us that before. And that's quite amazing because we're talking about places with chronic violent conflict in which people actually aren't invited to think about peace. And when we ask them to talk about peace and to think about peace, they end up very often talking about development, talking about access to employment, access to medical facilities, access to public goods. And that's actually really interesting that, you know, the wants and needs of people are actually quite universal. They don't differ from society to society. Every day is a school day as a researcher, and one of the actually quite funny things that we found when we asked people for signs of peace, if you knew that your society, your neighbourhood was at peace, whether it's in South Sudan or Uganda or Colombia, people say, actually, a sign of peace is when the dogs are quiet. Because a problem in many of these societies is crime and prowlers at night. And when there are prowlers around, the dogs are barking. So when the dogs are quiet, then the area is in peace. Now, the reason this is important is that for policymakers in the World Bank or in the United Nations, they're not actually thinking about issues of barking dogs, but that's what matters to people. That's how people see peace and conflict. So the important thing is to try to get these top-down and bottom-up analyses of peace to understand one another and to speak to one another.